In mid-1996, Sega released the AM3 developed Last Bronx in the arcade. It was done on the Model 2, Sega's premier polygon board that was home to other AM3 classics like Sega Rally and Gunblade New York. The Model 2 already played host to other 3D fighting games that had been extremely popular in Japan. The AM2 developed Virtua Fighter 2 had been an explosive success for Sega, and even Fighting Vipers had been really popular. This meant that AM3 had their hands full trying to create something that wouldn't be seen as a simple knockoff or carbon copy of what had come before it. They decided the way forward was to add weapons, a unique story, and gameplay that was tough as nails. This is Arcade Spotlight, Last Bronx. The story of Last Bronx goes quite a bit grittier than the Sega 3D fighting games before it. Set in a Tokyo where economic collapse has created crime and gangs fighting it out in the streets, these groups are comprised of kids left behind by society, and they are killing each other trying to gain positions of power and dominance. That's when a mysterious invitation to a tournament appears. Each gang would send their best to compete, and the winner and his gang would take control of Tokyo's underbelly. Of course, you don't see any of that in the actual arcade game. Like Virtua Fighter, these motivations and backstories are nowhere to be found, and instead were left to other forms of media to expand upon. In Japan, there were Last Bronx comics, a Last Bronx animated series, and if you can believe it, a freaking Last Bronx movie. This is actually part of the reason why Sega's IPs tended to do better in their home territory than they would abroad. Characters actually had well-known personalities there. Their motivations were clear and filled with context and backstory. Japanese gamers knew who these fighters were and had favorites based on not just their gameplay, but also on their representation in other areas of media. It was a completely different experience outside of Japan, where often you were faced with what seemed like generic characters completely devoid of any reason to be there. When it came to how Last Bronx would play, they decided to not stray far from what AM2 had set as the standard for Sega's fighting games. It employs the guard punch-kick interface, a deceptively simple configuration that belies a vast amount of moves, combos, and special attacks. What made this so very different from the likes of Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers was the addition of weapons-based combat. This changed virtually everything, from the types of combos, to the reach of the different weapons, to even the timing needed to counter successfully. It was still very much a game where mastering the block button and having the patience to pick apart your opponent's own defensive holes were keys to success. You come in hot trying to land aggressive combos on a seasoned player or the CPU set on a higher difficulty, and I guarantee you a quick trip to the continue screen. If you wanted to be really good at Last Bronx, you needed to understand that you were going to need to put in some time, understand each character's moves, and that the block button was the most important button in your arsenal. Also changed from Virtua Fighter was a much more natural jump attack, and being able to bounce your enemy off the ground for additional combo damage. Last Bronx is comprised of 8 main fighters. Here you get the usual assortment of male and female fighters, each with their own unique weapons. These are also pretty typical choices, things like nunchakus, a bow staff, tonfa, and sai. There are no bladed weapons in the game at all, hence no extreme blood or gore upon being hit. Unfortunately, Last Bronx did very poorly in the US. It was a rare arcade machine back then and is almost non-existent in today's world. I've seen this game in 2 cabinets. The first is an overseas full-size cab similar to Dead or Alive in Japan. The second is the only one I've ever seen in the US, and that's the garbage can cab that looks like the one used for Die Hard Arcade. This may make you believe this was an STV Titan release of the game, but it is not. This is the Sega Model 2, simply stripped down to be as affordable as possible. With US arcades being dominated by low-cost Namco machines for fighting games like the Tekken series, there was simply no room for an underperforming property on such a high-end arcade platform. Last Bronx would find little appreciation anywhere outside of Japan.
Round one, fight!
In August of 1997, Last Bronx was ported to the Sega Saturn by AM3 themselves. Their goal was to get the arcade version's frame rate and weapons effects on Saturn intact. They accomplished this, and even employed the Saturn's second VDP in a very powerful way, by basically creating the appearance of 3D backgrounds. This was a really effective use of the chip, and mimicked the arcade particularly well. They also added a bunch of extra options, including a special Saturn mode that centralized the story into one narrative, a watch mode similar to Virtua Fighter 2, as well as some art, movie, and practice modes to mess around with. It's actually a really solid port overall, but it still has issues. First, there are some glitches in the ground and ring graphics frequently. It manifests often during throws near or against the walls. The fenced-in arenas also have a fair bit of clipping and disappearing. It's also a shame that after more than 2 years on the market with a major next-generation machine, Sega still had not figured out how to present a decent story with hidden characters or proper extras in a home game. Even in its Saturn mode, which is basically a story mode, you have no clue what the hell is going on. Without the context of other media, it's just nonsensical cinemas without any real depth or meaning. One area the Saturn version really changed was the AI of your computer opponents. If you go into the options, you'll notice that the Saturn game gives you easy, normal, hard, and arcade difficulties. Essentially, the hardest mode on the Saturn is the easiest mode in the arcade. Playing these two games back to back on their default difficulties is like playing two different games. The Saturn AI falls for simple shit that allows you to basically whoop it uncontested. Even the later characters only need some mild attention to the block button to defeat easily. A start to finish game on the Saturn should last you no more than 4 to 6 minutes your very first time through. The arcade version, however, is another beast altogether. It will punish you for not blocking too much, and will snatch your ass out of your moves left and right to finish you ruthlessly. The arcade on its hardest setting is one of Sega's hardest games I've ever played. The AI is nothing short of god tier, and you'll need mad practice to beat it. There was also a PC release that was based on the Saturn version with improved graphics and retained much of the additional content. Sega also brought home Last Bronx to the PlayStation 2 in the Sega Ages 2500 Volume 24 in June of 2006. This is much closer visually to the arcade, and includes a progressive scan mode as well as the original frame rate of the arcade. This mimics the arcade's AI perfectly as well, and is just as difficult. It's the best home version of this game by quite a bit in my opinion, and was done by none other than M2. My memories of Last Bronx are pretty much non-existent in the arcade. I didn't see it often, didn't play it often, and really didn't have much to do with the game until it came home to the Saturn. It was there that I learned to appreciate it for what it was, and you just had to like what AM3 accomplished with those VDP2 powered backdrops. It really showed that when all the chips in the Saturn were doing what they were designed to do, a very solid 3D engine was the result. Of course, like many Saturn games, by the time Last Bronx hit the market, there was already talk of an add-on accelerator, replacement projects, and just the undeniable realization that the life of the Saturn was over. Most people just didn't care anymore, and Last Bronx would go unplayed by the masses. This was actually much of Sega's problem at the time, a complete inability to make games that were performing well in Japan perform well in other parts of the world. There was a massive disconnect between Sega of Japan and its customers in the West, and Last Bronx here was yet another victim. What we have left is a game that was well developed and fun to play, that simply has no modern way to actually play it. I would have loved to have seen Last Bronx 2 on the Dreamcast, and it's just begging for the Sega Ages treatment today. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.